Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Mastering Midlife, How to Thrive When the World Asks the Most of You. I am your host, Mark Silverman, and today I am speaking to my friend and a colleague, Phil Goddard. Phil is an internationally renowned coach and writer and speaker and author. He hosts his own podcast called The Coaching Life, which I was privileged to be on. He's the author of the Musings on Love series, which I think is going to go on because they're really incredible. He wrote a book called The Leadership Illusion. And besides being a colleague, he is a good friend. Phil, the reason he's on this podcast is because Phil called me sometime early last year and said, I've been meditating and you keep coming up in my meditation. And I need to talk. And because I love and respect Phil, I'm like, I'm in. So we talked, and Phil recommended a book that he doesn't remember even recommending that opened up my world. But he basically said, you know, Mark, there's a heaviness around you. There's a thickness around you that I just don't think is necessary. And it's something I think you're creating for yourself. And while we were talking, I was just kind of, I'll get to you in a second, Phil. Don't worry about it. I'm using here. You and your amazing microphone. It opened up a world to me and lifted this heaviness and this seriousness and the thickness of life that has been so altering, that the joy and the love and the ease with which I move through the world now is completely different from two conversations with Phil, just on a hunch of his that he followed. So I am so pleased to share you with this audience, Phil, because of the magic and the love you bring. Today, we're going to be talking about your father and how you healed a dysfunctional and difficult relationship with love, which is your topic, your ground zero of where you go with business and all that. So welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. I'm really honored, actually. I listened, as I was saying before you hit the record button, this is one of the few podcasts I do listen to, and I've been loving it all. So I feel absolutely honored to be here. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And I want everybody not to pay attention to the fact that Phil sounds deep and sexy because he has a way better, bigger mic than I do. But the content of the call. So Phil, when you and I were talking, you said that you think that the relationship with your father, the healing of that dysfunctional relationship, is something that a lot of men and women deal with, and that you found ways to address that. Want to tell me about that?
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'll start just recapping the kind of relationship I had with him, even as a child. And It's really beautiful to be able to look at all of that from the understanding that I have now. Because if you'd have asked me even just 2 years ago, perhaps 3 years ago, I would be telling you something different. So
what would you be telling me 2 years ago?
I would be telling you that he was an abusive man, that he didn't care about us, that he wanted out of the family. He got up and left very, very suddenly. It at the time, it felt really unexpected. I'm the youngest of 4 children. He waited until I was out at work, and literally within weeks, when I started my job, age 16, he got up and went. Said, "I'm seeing somebody else. I'm out of here. Bye." And at the time, that looked like a bolt out of the blue. But you can see the beauty of wisdom, and we might call it hindsight, can see that it was leading up to that, like that had to happen. So I can see that he was actually, he would come home from work most nights. He had a job, he was like 8 till 6, so we wouldn't really see him in the morning. In the evenings, he'd get home, we would have already eaten. So there was no family connection there as such. He would come home. My mother would give him his dinner very traditionally. We're talking about the 70s and 80s here. And then he would spend the evening sitting in his chair with headphones on. So he was completely disconnected from us. And occasionally he would show himself to discipline us. Now, it wasn't all like that.
That's when he got connected. So you got connected. He was either disconnected or abusive.
Well, that's kind of, that's how it looked. If I'm standing in, if I want to take that seat, okay.
So
I could.
but that's the seat from 2 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And the preceding 40 odd years, you know.
Right.
Um, I guess there's kind of three, maybe four stages to seeing this. There was the through most of that childhood of just avoiding him. Um, then there was the grin and bear it stage, perhaps in the teens. And I went through a stage actually. There was a transformational moment when I was 21, and my wife to be actually at the time had a telephone conversation and a fight on the telephone with his wife at the time. So his second wife, the woman that he had left my mother for. And the two of them had this huge fight. There was lots of name calling. Eventually, I got the phone off her and I got to speak to my dad, expecting us to kind of let's sort this out like adults. And he just said to me, Mark, you're no son of mine. And that was it. Click. And I repeatedly tried to call him and was told he didn't want to speak to me. That kind of brought everything to a head. And we went through a period of about 10 years where he refused to speak to me. We didn't speak to each other. And those were probably, they were the craziest 10 years of my life, that's for sure. Sometimes it looks like they're the most difficult until something more difficult comes along, of course. So, for the first 30 years of my life, I looked at my dad as some kind of abusive ogre who didn't really love his family. He was a very good provider. He worked hard, but he was never connected to us.
Mm.
And when my marriage actually, when that came to an end after about 10 years, I started looking at personal development, personal growth, and looking in that direction. I was really intrigued about human behavior because I came out of that marriage thinking, well, what the hell could I have done differently? And I still was in a lot of pain about my dad, and had counseling and whatever about that. And I had thought I had gone through a process, like we might call that stage 3 of forgiveness. So I've gone through trying to avoid it at all costs, grinning and bear it, and then this forgiveness. And that stayed with me up till a couple of years ago. So we would meet. I would maybe see him 2 or 3 times a year. No connection whatsoever. Still a little bit doing the grinning teeth kind of thing, maybe humoring him. But, he's 84 now. So this guy was in his 70s when we started, connecting and talking. And I felt really noble. I felt that's a really noble thing to do of me, to forgive him for the way he had treated all of us kids, and indeed my mother. And there's lots of little stories that even come to mind. In fact, I was talking to somebody about this just the other day, and that she was asking me, what's one of the really worst memories you remember, about as a child. I'd never advised that kind of inquiry, actually. But anyway, for the sake of this conversation, there was a time that's really it has stuck in my mind, where my father thought it would be really funny because we'd left the beach. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I'd left my shoes there. So he thought it'd be really funny after he dropped me out of the car to go and get my shoes to drive off and leave me there, literally just for 30 seconds to a minute. But I was quite distraught thinking I was being abandoned, and there's lots of little things like that. My sister quotes lots of things that he had said to her, perhaps in humor, that really now she still feels a lot of pain for. Well,
it's interesting when you talk about that. I was talking to Erin File, another guest on the show, after the show, and I told her that I had a breakthrough with some of her work, where I realized with my abuse as a child that I've spent my whole life trying to fix what happened to me. And she said, "Can I ask you to go a little further with that?" She says, "Why don't you try this on? That I spent my whole life trying to fix how I perceived what happened to me. Right. So that's where you're leading me here is, as you go through the stages, you're both you're both doing it from the standpoint of a child, and now you're growing to see that the perspectives were from a child, and now as a man, you're growing and starting to see it in different ways.
Yeah, although as I'll come to, the final resting place, if you like, is a place of understanding, which has brought absolute freedom and allowed a deeper loving
So
connection
the forgiveness
to
didn't
happen.
bring freedom.
Well,
It gave a little
forgiveness. So
relief,
here's the
but it
thing,
didn't
like,
give
so
freedom.
forgiveness is wonderful for relief, right? And sometimes that is necessary to then move beyond that. Now, no way am I going to say to anybody, don't look at forgiveness. It can serve as it's a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful stage. It's a wonderful thing to look at. Absolutely, because that one thing definitely did reduce some of the suffering. But in effect, Mark, forgiveness is still egotistic. I'm still coming from the place of I've been wronged.
Right.
I've been wronged. I'm judging
I've been
this.
wronged, and I'm forgiving that.
Absolutely. Yes.
So
Absolutely.
again, relief releases some of the poison, but it's not freedom, which is, again, another reason I love you, because talking to you, I found freedom. So please bring on the magic.
Yeah, because up to that point, I'm still taking on the identity of, if you like, the abused, for want of a better term. But that could be anything, the wronged, the person who was wronged. The moment came. I had a relationship breakup a couple of years ago, and it even surprised me how kind of badly I took that, given that I played a significant part in bringing it to a close. But in any case, there was one time I went around my dad's. I was in one of those real dark places, and it surprised me, because despite having this like understanding really of how we experience life, it's still a roller coaster at times, right? I went round his, and he's like, "So how are you doing?" And I could not stop myself, Mark. I just broke down and sobbed my heart out. And I'm guessing that that's the first time he had seen me cry since I was a really small child. Maybe, who knows, since he picked me up in the car from leaving me at the beach. I don't know. And because of the lack of connection, it was really awkward. He didn't really know what to do. He still doesn't. And in a kind of, I take some amusement out of that, but I have some affection for that. But anyway, I think I can't really put into words in a way of what perhaps happened in that moment, other than I guess I had exposed myself in a way, right? I had exposed this emotional part of me. But it wasn't, we weren't talking about him. We were talking, about what had happened and this breakup and whatever, and where I was. And on from that, I released my first book, and he doesn't get a very good press in my book, in either of the books. But I warned him this, but he was very gracious, and that, well, I want to read it. I want to understand. And after reading it, he called me up. Phil, I would love to talk about some of the things you've written in your book.
Wow.
He wanted to understand. And what occurred to me out of those conversations were he openly admitted that he was really old-fashioned as a father. And he said he had no idea how to be a dad, and the only role model he had was his dad, who was really old-fashioned for his era. So it was kind of my dad was basing his role as a father on some pretty Victorian values, if you like. Personally, I've always been pretty progressive as a parent. So rather than be one generation apart on our views on parenting, we're probably 3 or 4 generations apart in our views on parenting. And that little conversation just opened up a crack in, essentially there was a bubble around him in my mind that I couldn't get to. But he was opening up. And I started to see, really, I was reminded, because I had studied this in my work, in texts like A Course in Miracles and things like that, that um, he was showing me that he had always done what he thought to be best from a place of either love or fear.
Mm.
Now that's a great catch-all, right? I could say he'd always done what he thought was best from a place of love. That's not realistic. None of us always acts from a place of love. And the Course in Miracles summarizes this really beautifully. It suggests that all behaviors are either an expression of love or a call for love. And just as an example, coming back to his behavior, coming home from work, probably really tired, really did not want to be amongst, 3 or 4 kids running around, making a noise, particularly when we were teenagers doing stuff. He wanted away from that. Him sitting there with his headphones on, that's like a call for love.
Mm.
He is not actually, very well versed, very well practiced, perhaps at expressing love, at least in a way that
Oh,
we might like.
you and I spend countless hours learning how to deal with our humanity and how to communicate. Our fathers and mothers, who taught who taught them, right?
Oh, I don't think he will have never have had any of the kind of conversations we've had in the last couple of years. He's probably never had those kind of conversations in his previous 80 years. And that just to me deepened the understanding of. So it's not like if you like, I'm not excusing his behavior. Like there are times his behavior, I would still say, well, that's not acceptable to me. But I can understand where he was coming from within him in feeling he had to behave like that. And the key thing here is if I had the same thinking that he had, I would have behaved in the same way. And his thinking, as is for pretty much all of us, is, conditioned through our upbringing and all that we're doing, all that we're studying, whatever, as we go through life. And up to that point, I can sit in judgment. He should have known different. Well, that would be nice. Of course, that would be nice. But the reality of the situation was he was behaving based on the thinking that he had at the time, and that thinking is a product of his life up to that point. He had nobody to support him. We're so blessed, Mark, the work that we do, even though helping our clients nourishes us, right? Working with our clients nourishes and helps us and supports us. We're in this beautiful world of growth and discovery. And I love having these conversations around, I haven't really mentioned the L word much, have I? Around love and what have you. He just he didn't have access to that. Didn't have access to that world. So he's really basing his life view consists of all of his upbringing to that point.
Mm. So understanding that intellectually, what did that do for you as far as the key to freedom?
Great question, Mark. Love that. Because intellectually, I thought I already saw that. When I was in the forgiveness stage, I would have probably even used similar kind of words to describe that.
And that's what I heard. I'm listening to you, and you haven't mentioned the L word, the love word, but my heart is like completely broken open. I'm so in love with my father at the moment, and I haven't thought much of my father in a while. And I have a specific moment where he was so real with me that it was exquisite. So even though you're not saying the L word, I know I am completely broken open from this conversation. So back to what you were saying is you now have an understanding. Now I'm looking for the keys to freedom.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And I think that breaking open happened in that moment of me breaking down and crying in front of him, and him in all of his inexperienced awkwardness in feeling, affection for me, compassion for me in that moment, and not having any clue how to show that. Um, that did, yeah, definitely at that point, my heart was breaking open and I became more open, you know what, to seeing him. Instead of seeing him through my stories of him, which is how we look at pretty much everybody until we notice we're doing that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of looking at him through my stories of him, I got curious in that openness to what were his stories and started to explore them. Well, what was it like for you? And that was how the conversations about him learning how to be a dad from his father came around, because the walls fell away in that, just really in that, well, hang on, what was it? What is your story? What brought you here? What did you feel like when you were coming home from work? And I'd never had that kind of conversation with him up to that point. I just sat in my chair of judgment. I'd forgiven him for it, but I didn't understand. And like I say, I want to stress this because I've spoken to clients and whatever, and there is that, yeah, but the behavior is unacceptable. Because you know what, Mark, the same thing's going on with anybody who is abusive. The same thing's going on with people who are abusive, even murderers and what have you. They are responding to the thinking that they believe in the moment. And that doesn't make it acceptable in our society. And we are to put in measures to protect ourselves from that. However, nobody inflicts pain without being in pain themselves. The flip side of that is when we feel love, we simply love. We can express that. So in that opening up, I really started to see for the first time my dad and all of his struggles.
So
And you know,
can I just, so I can track with you, what I hear you saying is that just because you understand, just because you can do the work of the shadow work of putting yourself in his world and understanding his world, it doesn't excuse the behavior, but it unlocks some kind of understanding so you're not trapped by the behavior. You're not victimized anymore by the behavior. It becomes more outside and objective rather than subjective to you.
I was seeing that there was a father, a dad who existed outside of my story, excuse me, outside of my story, beyond my story of him.
Right. So he's no longer your dad who did this to you.
That,
he's a dad who lived this world.
In seeing that, I was free from my story.
Beautiful.
Like the story just fell away and I'm free from that. And I'm actually filled with compassion for this fellow human being who is going through this life suffering. Even though I have a really strong preference for him not to, express that suffering in the ways that he did. But I'm filled with compassion for that because I understand where his experience of that suffering is coming from. And, the connection is, yes, I get it. If I believed what he was believing, I would have behaved in the same way. Mm. What's to forgive in that? Like, really, what is to forgive in that?
It falls away. It just falls away. I'm thinking, so it was readily available for me to break open for my father. For my mother was the one that I have the difficult relationship with. She, I'm really sure she had narcissistic disorder. I'm really sure of that. But it was my story that actually had me have forgiveness and get some separation from the personalization. When last year, when we were sitting in the doctor's office and she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, every once in a while, the narcissism would lift and my mother would show up. So in order for me not to be hurt by a lot of the things that happen and take them personally, I had to see her as her disease and not my mother. I really had to be clear that my mother actually didn't really show up or exist. This was a disorder that I was in relationship with. And I know that because acutely, when the curtains parted and my mother showed up, there was a different person, a different quality. And when she was diagnosed with cancer, we were sitting in the doctor's office for 50. I could start crying right now. For 15 minutes, my mother, the little girl, showed up, and she started talking about her childhood, and she started talking about her life and how she resented her children and how she resented her husband and she resented everybody because of what happened to her when she was a child and her worldview. And it was absolutely exquisite and heartbreaking and all that. And then the curtains closed and the narcissism came right back in. But now with your talking, you're giving me a key because I've forgiven my mother and I'm not free of my mother. So now with this conversation, I have a map in which to start walking to explore the freedom part of this. So I love you and I am grateful for this, for your insights.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Can I ask you, this would be a great place to stop the podcast, but I woke up with a question, and in my meditation, I had a question. You are the love guy, and you did break me open to a freedom that I'm free. Like I can't even say anything after that. I'm just free. And I would love to just hear your definition of love.
Yeah. In relation to my dad, what happened there was I, as I said, essentially relinquished my story. That fell away. And allowed myself to see him. Now, I couldn't do that from a place of fear. My story was based entirely on fear and protection. It might look like, actually, the story primarily looks like it's based on protection. But
and we're told to do that. Don't open yourself up and be vulnerable to the abuser. Absolutely. That's just asking for more abuse. So we're told not to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas dropping that story, essentially, I'm dropping my protection. I'm stepping out of fear into love and being open to understand him. Show me you. There's a definition of love. People would suggest perhaps love's a feeling or whatever. I want to answer this in two parts, actually, because I want to give you one example about love.
I know I gave you a question that actually can't be answered with words, so I know I put you on the spot.
Well, so I was going to say that I don't think we can necessarily define it, but I'll describe some attributes of love, right? So yes. One is, I believe love is an intelligence, and I want to come back to that point with a very brief client story. But also, if I were to describe attributes of love, I would say absolute, unconditional acceptance. So absolute as it encompasses everything and everybody. So absolute, nothing's excluded. Unconditional, there's no yeah buts or only when or only if. I'm only going to love my dad if he behaves this way. No, I love him unconditionally. Absolute unconditional. Well, acceptance is simply the absence of resistance. So I can have a preference. I'd really like it to be different, but I'm no longer energizing the resistance. I'm seeing, and I'm really seeing, in the case of my dad, I'm really seeing how he is. Absolute unconditional acceptance. The intelligence piece, it's interesting, for me, it fascinates me that in most, even religious scriptures, God is described as love. God is love. And I'm not particularly religious. I that cliche, yeah, spiritual, not religious kind of thing. But I believe in a concept of God in the same way as love. To me, they really are the same thing, the intelligence behind life. Like, I feel that we're connected to something. It's like, I have no idea what God is, but look what she's done, Mark. Yeah. So One of my favorite inquiries, what would love do, has us drop into and be open to the intelligence of love. And just very briefly, we talk about, we spoke about how love can heal, if you like, dysfunctional relationships. One of my favorite client stories is a client who came to me. She didn't hire me for this reason, but it came up that she had a relationship breakdown with a really close friend. Like, they did everything together. They would hang out all the time, on the phone most nights. Something happened. I have no idea why. I didn't need to know. That relationship completely broke down. Texts weren't returned, blocked on Facebook, all that kind of stuff. And my client's coming to me and clearly very distressed about this. And all we focused on was her dropping all of the stories of how it should be and focusing on that, yes, that feeling of love, but really that just being in absolute unconditional acceptance for that person and the situation. And out of the blue, Mark, it had been years, out of the blue, there was two stages to this. One, my client comes to me on a call, like, yeah, I really get it, Phil. I really get it. I'm so happy. I feel so much love for my friend now. And then a few weeks later, on one of our calls, she's in tears. Can you believe it? My friend sent me a message. Now, that might be a coincidence, but I've heard it said, I don't know if it's Wayne Dyer that said coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. But maybe it is. But that's not the only example I have. It's like, I think, and this is kind of what's happened with my dad, and I've seen it with numerous clients, that getting in touch with love instead of entertaining all of those stories can be so powerful and is absolutely liberating.
I thank you. I can feel it through your voice. I can feel it in the ether. And again, I can't define what love is, but when you're speaking, love is whatever's left when we just let everything else drop off. And then you just are speechless with the exquisiteness of it. Phil, thank you for your magic.
Thank you,
I
Mark.
appreciate it. I'm going to put in the show notes links to Phil's books, to his podcast. If you want to get to know him more, he has a myriad of podcasts where he gets to talk to really, really incredible people, but his wisdom comes through also. So again, Phil, thank you. And to everybody else, thank you for taking the time to listen. I love you, and have a great rest of the day.